If you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place. Tonight's story takes us to the lush, tropical valleys of Hawaii, a place most people associate with vacations and postcards. But as a man named David was about to find out, there are parts of those islands that belong to something much older and much more dangerous. There is a law in the islands of Hawaii that isn't written in any state assembly book or tourist brochure. It is a law of the soil, a law of the blood, and a law of the dead. It is a warning that every local, from the surfers on the North Shore to the grandmothers in Hilo, gives to those who wander too far off the paved roads after the moon has reached its peak. They tell you, if you hear the drums, do not run. If you see the torches, do not look. Hide your face in the dirt, and pray that your ancestors recognize you. To most tourists, the mainlanders who come for the Mai Tais and the sunsets, this sounds like nothing more than colorful folklore. A bit of island flavor to tell the folks back in Ohio or Pennsylvania. But for a man named David, a high-level corporate consultant from Seattle, the legend of the night marchers, the Huaka'i Pō, was about to become the only reality that mattered. David was a man who lived his life by logic, data, and the undeniable power of a well-maintained rental Jeep. He was 48 years old, successful, and deeply skeptical of anything that couldn't be explained by a spreadsheet. It was late August, and he had spent the evening at a remote lookout point near the Pali Highway, trying to clear his head after a grueling week of meetings in Honolulu. He'd stayed too long, watching the sun dip into the Pacific like a burning coin, and by the time he started the engine to head back to his resort, the heavy, tropical darkness had swallowed the valley. The drive was supposed to take 40 minutes. But as he descended through the lush, overgrown valleys of the Nuuanu Pali, the atmosphere began to shift. The air conditioning in the Jeep, which had been humming steadily, suddenly began to blow a damp, earthy chill that smelled of crushed ginger, wet stone, and something metallic, like old coins or rusted iron. Then, the sound started. It was faint at first, a rhythmic, low-frequency thumping that David initially mistook for a problem with his tires or perhaps a subwoofer in a distant car. Thump. 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 He slowed down, peering through the windshield, but the road ahead was empty. The high beams of his Jeep cut through a mounting fog that seemed to rise out of the asphalt itself. He pulled over to the shoulder, the gravel crunching under his tires. He stepped out of the vehicle, intending to check for a flat. The moment his boots hit the ground, the silence of the jungle hit him like a physical blow. There were no birds. No rustling leaves. No wind. Only that rhythmic thumping. In the distance, further up the ridge where no hiking trail existed, David saw a flicker of light. Then another. Small, amber orbs of fire were moving in a perfect, unwavering line through the impenetrable brush. They weren't moving like hikers with flashlights, they were gliding, moving with a terrifying, synchronized grace toward the very road where he was standing. David felt a cold sweat break out across his brow. He remembered the waiter at the luau 2 nights ago, a man with traditional tattoos and eyes that seemed to look right through you. The man had leaned in close and whispered, "The spirits of the warriors don't care about your trespassing laws, mister. If you are on their path, you belong to the path." He scrambled back into the Jeep, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He fumbled for the keys, but as he looked into his rearview mirror, he saw the first of the torches cresting the hill behind him. They weren't orange like a campfire, they burned with a strange, violet-white intensity that seemed to drain the color out of the world. The drumbeat grew louder, filling the cabin of the car until the glass began to rattle in the frames. David realized then that he wasn't just watching a parade. He was standing in the middle of a spectral procession that had been walking the same path for 1,000 years, and he was the only living thing in their way. He tried to turn the key, but the engine was dead. Not just stalled, dead. The dashboard lights flickered and died, leaving him in total darkness as the first torchlight began to spill over his shoulder. The violet-white glow from the torches was now so bright it felt like it was scorching the interior of the Jeep. David sat paralyzed, his hand still gripped around the dead ignition key. The sound was no longer just a drumbeat, it was a physical weight. The chanting grew into a roar, a rhythmic, guttural cadence that felt like it was being shouted by 1,000 lungs that no longer held air. He looked out the side window and saw them. They were cresting the ridge, moving through the thick tropical ferns as if the vegetation didn't exist. These were not the warriors you see in tourist shows. They were giants. Their skin was the color of volcanic ash, and they wore feather capes that seemed to be woven from shadows. Their eyes, those who had them, glowed with a dull, internal heat, like embers at the bottom of a dying fire. The warning from the luau waiter finally broke through David's wall of skepticism. "Hide your face. Do not look." With a frantic, clumsy movement, David threw himself out of the jeep. He didn't run. He knew he wouldn't make it 5 feet before those spears found his back. Instead, he collapsed onto the damp asphalt of the road. He pressed his face hard against the gravel, his eyes squeezed shut so tight his head began to ache. He locked his hands behind his neck and prayed to a God he hadn't spoken to in 20 years. The ground began to vibrate. It wasn't just the drums anymore, it was the synchronized strike of hundreds of bare feet hitting the road. Slap! 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 The air around him suddenly turned freezing cold, smelling of deep-sea salt and old, dried shark skin. The humidity of the Hawaiian night vanished, replaced by a dry, ancient chill that felt like it had been pulled from the bottom of a glacier. Then, the procession reached him. The footsteps didn't go around the jeep. They went through it. David heard the metal of his rental car groan and creak as if it were being compressed by an immense pressure. He heard the glass of the windshield shatter, but it didn't sound like breaking glass, it sounded like a soft, crystalline sigh. And then, the footsteps stopped. The chanting died down to a low, menacing hum. David felt a presence standing directly over him. The heat radiating from this figure was so intense it felt like his hair might catch fire. He could hear the heavy clatter of a lei miho pala'oa, a necklace of whale teeth, swinging just inches from his ear. A voice, deep and resonant like the grinding of tectonic plates, spoke a single word. It was a question. He didn't need to know the language to feel the meaning. Who is this intruder on the path of the kings? David felt a cold, sharp sensation against the nape of his neck. It was the tip of a spear, obsidian, jagged, and older than the country David called home. He felt a tear track through the dirt on his cheek. He realized that his life, his career, his logistics, none of it mattered here. He was a speck of dust in the path of a hurricane. Just as the pressure of the spear began to break the skin, a second voice joined the first. This one was further back in the line, softer, but filled with an undeniable authority. It was the voice of a woman, a high priestess or perhaps a queen. She spoke a short command, her voice echoing off the valley walls like a silver bell. The obsidian tip was withdrawn. The heat above David's back shifted. The drums resumed, louder and more triumphant than before. For what felt like hours, the army of the dead marched over and around him. He heard the mournful wail of conch shells blowing from the peaks above, a sound that signaled the passage of the Ali'i into the sacred grounds of the valley. When the last of the footsteps finally faded, and the temperature returned to the sticky, tropical warmth of the night, David didn't move. He stayed face down in the gravel for a long time, listening to his own frantic heartbeat. When he finally dared to lift his head, his jeep was gone. Not stolen, just gone. In its place was a scorched, blackened rectangular patch on the asphalt, exactly the size of the car's footprint. And lying right in front of his eyes, placed carefully on the road, was a small, polished tooth. It wasn't from a shark or a dog. It was human. And it was still warm to the touch. The walk back toward the lights of the Poly Highway felt like a journey through a different dimension. David didn't have his phone, it had vanished along with the jeep, and the silence of the Hawaiian jungle now felt predatory, as if the trees themselves were watching him to see if he had truly learned his lesson. Every snap of a twig or rustle of a fern sent a jolt of adrenaline through his system that made his hands shake uncontrollably. When he finally stumbled onto the main road, his clothes were torn, his face was smeared with the red volcanic mud of the valley, and his eyes had the hollow, thousand-yard stare of a man who had seen the end of the world. A passing motorist, a local man in a beat-up pickup truck, pulled over. He didn't ask David if he'd been in a car accident. He didn't ask if he'd been mugged. He took one look at the scorched dirt on David's forehead and the way he was clutching that small, warm human tooth in his palm, and he simply opened the passenger door. "You were on the path," the driver said. It wasn't a question. It was a somber recognition. The driver's name was Manu. He didn't take David to the police station, and he didn't take him to the hospital. He took him to a small, unassuming house on the windward side of the island where an elderly woman, Manu's grandmother, was sitting on the porch, waiting as if she knew they were coming. She didn't speak English well, but she didn't need to. She looked at David's neck, where the obsidian spear had left a faint, jagged scratch. Then she looked at the tooth. She closed David's fingers over the relic and began to chant, a soft, melodic version of the guttural drone David had heard in the valley. "The Ali'i spared you," Manu translated, his voice low and respectful. "But they didn't let you go for free. You saw the fire that doesn't burn wood. You heard the drums that don't have skin. You are a witness now. And a witness carries a burden." For the next 3 days, David couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those violet-white torches. Every time the wind picked up, he heard the rhythmic slap 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 of bare feet on the road. But the most terrifying part was the physical change. The scratch on his neck wasn't healing. In fact, it was turning a deep, bruised purple, and the skin around it felt unnaturally hot, not with the heat of an infection, but with the dry, radiating heat of a volcanic vent. He tried to go back to his life in Seattle. He sat in his glass-walled office, looking out at the gray skyline of the Pacific Northwest, trying to focus on mergers and acquisitions. But the spreadsheets now looked like gibberish. The voices of his colleagues sounded thin and tinny, like they were speaking from the other side of a thick pane of glass. One night, a week after his return, David was working late. The office was empty, the only sound the hum of the HVAC system. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Not a power surge, they changed color. For a split second, the fluorescent office lights turned a brilliant, sickly violet. David froze. He didn't look up. He looked at the glass partition of his office. In the reflection, he saw the hallway behind him. It wasn't empty. A line of shadows was moving past his door. They didn't have bodies, just silhouettes made of shifting ash. And in the center of the line, a tall figure paused. The figure didn't have a face, but David could feel those ember-like eyes locking onto the back of his head. He realized then what Manu's grandmother had meant. The night marchers don't just walk the islands. They walk the paths of power, the ancient lines of energy that crisscross the earth. And once you have bowed to them, once you have felt the heat of their torches, you are no longer a citizen of the modern world. You are a landmark on their map. He reached into his pocket and felt the tooth. It was pulsing. It was vibrating in time with a drumbeat that was now beginning to echo through the vents of the skyscraper. The corporate consultant from Seattle, the man of logic and data, did the only thing he knew would save him. He didn't call security. He didn't run for the elevator. He slowly stood up, moved to the center of his office, and knelt on the expensive designer carpet. He pressed his face into the fabric, closed his eyes, and waited for the kings to pass through. The elevator doors at the Seattle firm didn't open for 30 minutes that night. Security footage later showed David's office door vibrating as if a heavy freight train were passing through the hallway, yet the motion sensors remained silent. When the janitorial staff finally entered the suite at 4 a.m., the office was pristine, save for one detail: every digital clock in the building had stopped at the exact same moment, and the air smelled inexplicably of tropical ozone and sun-bleached bone. David was found leaning against his desk, staring out at the Puget Sound. He was physically unharmed, but those who knew him said the man who returned from Hawaii wasn't the same man who had left. He resigned from his firm within 48 hours. He didn't ask for a severance package. He didn't even pack his awards. He simply walked out with the clothes on his back and a small, worn piece of jade he'd started carrying in his pocket, a gift, he claimed, from a woman he'd met in a dream. The legend of the night marchers is often told as a cautionary tale for those visiting the islands, but for the older generation of Hawaii, the ones who remember the old ways before the high rises, the story doesn't end at the shoreline. They believe that the Huaka'i Pō are not just ghosts, but the guardians of the sacred order. When you cross their path and survive, you aren't just lucky. You have been marked as a temporary bridge between the world of the living and the world of the ancestors. There is a final, chilling addendum to David's story that circulated among the local community in Oahu months later. Manu, the driver who had found David on the road, returned to that same stretch of the new Wanu Pali on the anniversary of the encounter. He went there to offer a traditional gift of Huaka'i Pō, a gesture of respect to keep the spirits at peace. As the moon reached its zenith, Manu didn't hear the drums. He didn't see the torches. But he found something lying on the asphalt, precisely where David's rental Jeep had vanished a year prior. It was a corporate ID badge, encased in heavy plastic. It belonged to David. The plastic wasn't melted, and the lanyard wasn't torn, but the photo of David had changed. The man in the photo wasn't wearing a suit and tie anymore. His eyes were no longer clear and blue, they were two dim, glowing embers. And behind him, in the background of the ID photo where there should have been a white office wall, was a line of violet torches stretching back into an infinite darkness. This is the warning we leave you with tonight. The modern world likes to think it has paved over the past. We build skyscrapers of glass and steel, we install fiber optic cables, and we believe that data has replaced destiny. But some paths were carved into the earth long before the first stone was laid. Some armies still march, and they do not recognize your titles, your bank accounts, or your skepticism. If you ever find yourself on a lonely road, whether it's in the mountains of Hawaii, the forests of the Pacific Northwest, or the quiet suburbs of the Midwest, and the wind suddenly dies down. If the crickets stop their song and the air begins to smell of salt and old fire, do not reach for your phone to record it. Do not try to be a hero for social media. Remember David. Remember the corporate man who thought he was untouchable until he felt the cold tip of an obsidian spear against his soul. Turn off your lights. Lay your face in the dirt. And above all, do not look up. Because some processions are not meant for living eyes, and once you join the march, there is no turning back. Good night, stay safe, and may your ancestors walk beside you, rather than behind you.